Okay, so the big story today, I have four big stories for you, is that Putin said no without saying no. And now is the president going to put some pressure on him? So it's Thursday, March 13th, 2025. So Trump's special envoy, Witkoff, has arrived in Moscow, Russia. At the airport, he's set to engage in ceasefire negotiations. That's earlier this morning. History, he says, this is Jason J. Smart, says, will not look back on this moment kindly. A fragile peace founded on deception will only ignite greater conflicts. Well, that's assuming that you can actually get to the peace deal. I'm not so sure that we're going to get there, but he would be right if that was the case. Okay. Now, Euromaidan Press. Now, we were talking about like Witkoff. Why is Witkoff? Why not General Kellogg? NBC News has answered the question. Russia did not want Kellogg at peace talks. Quote, Kellogg is a former American general too close to Ukraine, not our kind of person, not of the caliber we are looking for, unquote, according to a Kremlin official. Okay, so where are we in this discussion? So Zelensky saying that the Ukrainian delegation provided him with a detailed report on its meeting with U.S. representatives in Saudi Arabia. It's good that the conversation was entirely constructive. That's good to hear, and they're moving towards peace. Our representatives informed the U.S. side about Ukraine's principled positions. Ukraine was ready for an air and sea ceasefire, but the U.S. proposed extending it to land. Ukraine welcomes that proposal. We decided the need to guarantee security, or we discussed the need to guarantee security. Regrettably, for more than a day already, the world has yet to hear a meaningful response from Russia to the proposals that were made. We hope that U.S. pressure will be sufficient to compel Russia to end the war. Let me repeat that last line. We hope that U.S. pressure will be sufficient to compel Russia to end the war, meaning it's back in your court, Donald, and you have to deal with that. And so, okay, he will. Here's what he had to say, but it wasn't quite dealing with it the way that you would maybe hope that he would deal with it. He says, we would like to see a ceasefire from Russia, and if not, it'll be a very disappointing moment for the world. But there's other things that he said in here that makes me go, wait, what?
To see a ceasefire from Russia. And we have, not been working in the dark. We've been discussing with Ukraine land and pieces of land that would be kept and lost.
Kept and lost. So the Ukrainians would keep part of Ukraine and the Russians would keep part of Ukraine is probably what it is. They should have been talking about how we, Ukraine, need a 4 oblasts around the edge of Russia to be a buffer zone between us and them, and then be dealing with it like that. I mean, I know that that's not going to happen. I know it's not realistic, but I mean, it's only the Ukrainians that are going to be losing here.
All of the other elements of a final agreement. There's a power plant involved, a very big power plant involved. Who's going to get the power plant? And
that's all the way down in Zaporizhzhia. You're talking about giving that away as well? Like, we're not talking about that little bit of Donbass that they first picked up before the war. Like, if everything went to before the war broke out, that would just be a little strip in Donbass and Crimea. Here, we're talking about like huge chunks of Ukraine.
Who's going to get this and that? And so, it's not an easy process. But phase one is the ceasefire. A lot of the individual subjects have been discussed, though. We've been discussing concepts of land because you don't want to waste time with the ceasefire if it's not going to mean anything. So we're saying, look, this is what you can get. This is what you can't get. They discussed NATO and being in NATO, and everybody knows what the answer to that is. They've known that answer for 40 years.
Wow. So he's hard against NATO, and the Ukrainian delegation was saying it's important that they're not going to abandon being part of other international institutions. And so that's going to come to some loggerheads later on. But right now,
in all fairness, a lot of the details of a final agreement have actually been discussed. Now we're going to see whether or not Russia's there, and if they're not, it'll be a very disappointing moment for the world.
Well, prepare to be disappointed. Here's the headlines in the papers today. The world's watching. Ukraine agreed to a ceasefire deal. The ball is in Russia's court, and multiple papers are saying the same kind of thing. Okay. Meanwhile, the Europeans aren't just sitting around waiting for things to happen. Europe's security is at a turning point, says the Secretary of Defense in Britain. Together, we're stepping up, and there's like multiple indications that Europe is stepping up. Finland and Ukraine have signed a bilateral defense cooperation agreement. Finland's defense ministry said that it would give a new military aid package to Ukraine worth about 200 million euros, including artillery ammunition to help the war with Russia, to help it in the war with Russia. Okay, Ukraine receives the first tranche of 1.7 billion from Canada, secured by revenues from frozen Russian assets. Army chiefs from 30 plus nations met in Paris to discuss European-led security force for Ukraine after a ceasefire, with France and the UK pushing for deterrence as the US steps back. But there's a little bit more to this that's really interesting. This is Jason J. Smart's comments on the same article. Britain and France may strike Russian facilities if the ceasefire collapses, according to AP. Bloomberg says that they are forming a coalition to support Ukraine involving Europe and Asia. Australia, Japan, New Zealand joined talks on Tuesday. Yeah. So, okay, let's try to play that out. So let's say they agree to a ceasefire. Ukraine's already agreed. Let's say Putin comes to the table and has a ceasefire, and then they break it. When they break it, does that mean that the Europeans are then, let's go beyond a ceasefire, a final peace deal? When the Russians break the deal, it's not really an if, it's really more of a when. Does that mean that the Europeans are drawn into a conflict on Ukrainian soil and or perhaps even Russian soil? That's what it's starting to look like. So you got to get this thing right. If you get it wrong, very bad things can happen. A stark warning from Trump's former Ukraine envoy, Kurt Volker. Putin is Putin. Putin will not come up with a reasonable approach to dealing with Ukraine. He doesn't want to live next door to an independent free Ukraine. He doesn't want Ukraine to be able to protect itself. So we're going to end up in a situation where, despite what President Trump would like to do of engaging with Putin and reaching a deal, I just don't believe Putin will ever do it. I think there's something very reasonable about that perception. Now, it's reasonable, especially in light of this. The Washington Post found a leaked document that revealed Kremlin hardline Ukraine negotiation strategy. A Moscow think tank with FSB ties details Russia's maximalist demands for Ukraine in a February document dismissing territorial compromise and Trump's proposed peace timeline. So, here's what we find. Peace in Ukraine is impossible by 2026. Like, we're in 2025 now, and they're saying it's impossible by 2026. European intelligence has received a document with tough Russian demands for peace talks, according to the Washington Post. Main points. The document speaks to the need for a complete dismantling of the current Ukrainian government. The document, compiled in February by a Moscow think tank closely aligned with the Russians, sets out maximalist demands. The Russian Federation should weaken the U.S. negotiating position on Ukraine, inflaming tensions between Trump administration and other countries. It seems like that one's working, while continuing efforts to dismantle the Ukrainian state. Trump's previous plans to reach a peace agreement within 100 days are rejected as impractical. The creation of a buffer zone in northeastern Ukraine along the border with Bryansk and Belgorod regions of the Russian Federation, as well as the militarized zone in the south, including part of Odessa region, is being considered. So a buffer zone by Bryansk and Belgorod that is within Ukrainian territory that the Russians control in there, that they'll call part of their constitutional territory and that sort of thing. And then one down by Odessa. So they're going to cut them off on the sea. Yeah, that's what they're trying to do. Anti-peacekeeping forces are called unnecessary. Well, unnecessary maybe to them, but very necessary from the European perspective. So what happened here ultimately, final big story, Putin effectively rejected the ceasefire proposal. Putin often doesn't say no directly. He's manipulating, obstructing the process. So ultimately he said "niet." But how did he say "niet"? Well, he didn't say "niet." He said this. Russian President Vladimir Putin said on Thursday that he agrees in principle with a U.S. proposal for a 30-day ceasefire in Ukraine, but the terms needed to be worked out, and he emphasized that it should pave the way to a lasting peace. Quote, "So the idea itself is correct, and we certainly support it," unquote. Putin told a news conference in Moscow. Quote, "But there are issues that we need to discuss, and I think that we need to discuss it with our American colleagues and partners," unquote. So again, accepting the idea of a ceasefire is not accepting a ceasefire. That's a delaying tactic. And now, 6% of you in the survey said the Russians are going to accept it immediately. So that's wrong. So now we're left with the people that are about, up to a month or 3 to 6 months or 6 months or longer or that sort of thing. And I think it's going to be a longer term play than a shorter term one. Institute for the Study of War. If the Kremlin holds a ceasefire hostage to demand preemptive concessions while continuing to pursue battlefield victories, that would strongly indicate that Russia lacks any urgency about ending the war and is uninterested in making any meaningful concessions. I think that's fair. They're not interested in making any concessions. They want to keep going for maximalist aims. Russia's presidential assistant, Yuri Yushakov, says, quote, a temporary ceasefire is just a pause for Ukrainian forces. Well, it's a pause for Russians as well. I mean, they're not going to just sit around and wait. Actions mimicking peace efforts are unnecessary. Russia seeks a long-term peace settlement that respects its interests. Okay, so again, what are the Russians going to do? They're just going to rearm. What you're going to have is both sides stop, pause. Ukraine will dig trenches and rearm. Russia is going to move all its forces up as close as possible to the line. And then when it kicks off, it's going to kick off and be bloodier than it ever has been. Okay, worrying insight from a retired British Army officer who was NATO's deputy supreme commander in Europe. His name is Sir Richard Sharif. He says, quote, if Russia refuses a ceasefire, the illusion of diplomacy collapses. But if Russia accepts the ceasefire, then the real test begins. So let's hear just a little bit of what he has to say here.
Well, Sir Richard Sharif is a retired British Army officer who was NATO's deputy supreme commander Europe from 2011 to 2014, and he joins me now from Salisbury. Good evening. In the last few days, you've been extremely critical of Donald Trump. I think you wrote an article saying it was worse than appeasement of Nazi Germany, the way he was behaving. But it now appears that Ukraine and Europe and Britain are all going along with it. Are they wrong?
I think the ceasefire, and this is a Ukrainian proposal, the Ukrainians have accepted the proposal for ceasefire. So this is a clever move, I think, by President Zelensky, designed to force a moment of clarity.
That's right. It's designed to force Putin to come to the table. Are you really in it? Or are you really not in it? And Putin is doing his best to delay and look like he's really interested when he's really not.
If Russia refuses, the illusion of diplomacy collapses. If Russia accepts the ceasefire, then the real test begins.
But what Russia did was try to thread that needle right between those two options and say, no, we're interested. Well, we just have to work out some things first. Yeah, that's going to be delayed for some time, in my estimation.
Now, the question is whether and when Washington will recognize when Russia inevitably breaks that ceasefire, as it absolutely certainly will, because nothing can trust Russia. And that will allow Russia once again to dictate the terms of reality to President Trump and the rest of the American regime.
And that is what Putin's ultimate goal is to dictate the reality of the ceasefire by saying we're going to only come to the table with these maximalist demands and Ukraine's going to have to accept. And the longer it goes on, I think Putin is thinking the longer it goes on, the better chance that they have.
So would that be your view of any peace deal that were to come out of this ceasefire if it were to happen? There's a lot of ifs there, I accept. But, do you think Russia would always end up breaking any peace?
Absolutely. Absolutely, no question about it. It'll manufacture an excuse, it'll stage an attack, it'll flood the information space with fabricated so-called evidence that Ukraine has violated the deal, it'll claim victimhood, it'll weaponize diplomacy. Russia cannot be trusted and this is in a sense the naivety of the White House, that Russia has only ever been an empire. If Russia listened to that young 18-year-old recruit wearing a black balaclava talking to your interviewer, they would understand that Russia is an imperial state that will never stop until it has dismembered Ukraine, brought it back under the Russian Empire, removed it from the map as a sovereign state. And the only thing that is going to force Russia to stop is if Russia is firmly stopped and defeated. And that clearly, right now, is not on the cards.
I know. If I was a betting man, I would say that everything he said is exactly right, that Russia will keep going as long as Russia can keep going. Okay, just a little bit left. Okay, this is the fourth big story. I couldn't believe that I was seeing this. The Russian Ministry of Defense, Maria Zakharova, put this out today. before Putin said, no, we agree in principle, but we're going to have to see what the details are. Zakharova said this: we once again urge the UN Secretariat to stop covering up Ukraine's staged provocation and to support a thorough investigation into the Bucha tragedy. And there's a picture below that you can't see. It's off screen, and it's intentionally off screen because of YouTube, because I just can't show that. The Bucha tragedy, ensuring that those responsible for this heinous crime of the Kyiv authorities are held accountable. I mean, I don't even know how do you deal with that level of evil? I mean, this is the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs that's putting this out. My response was, are they kidding? They're talking about Bucha being some sort of fake on the day that Putin is rejecting a peace deal. Do they expect that by being so blatant that they are more likely to be believed? This is absolutely horrible, and the world has yet to address it. And they still need to address it. These are war crimes, and they need to be addressed. Okay, last, I'll leave you with this from Darth Putin. Russia is concerned that Ukraine will be able to defend itself when we invade again. Yeah, that's what they're worried about. All right, my friends, thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, and the subscribes. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.